The theme of the 2004-2005 Centre Lecture Series is Christians Without Borders. In his book, The Sacred Balance, David Suzuki questions the boundaries we create between human beings and nature, between us and the environment. And he notes that human beings are made up. I mean, the difference between you at conception and you at 80 kilos or 90 kilos is the stuff that you've taken in from the world around you. And so how can you possibly expect a clean line between human beings and the rest of the world? How can you expect the rest of the world to be polluted and you to be clean? How can you expect the rest of the world to be unhealthy and you to be healthy when you are made up of all the stuff that is not you? The air, the water, the minerals in the ground, that becomes you. And so the line between human beings and the rest of the world is in science and in theology becoming a fuzzier line. However, Christians have in the past created a great divide between humans, the subjects of salvation history, and the rest of the web of life, the objects that we use in the course of salvation history. The ecological crisis, along with the theories of evolution, publicly accepted by John Paul II, calls us to rethink these borders. How can we expect to be saved if all the stuff that makes us up is destroyed? Last October, ecofeminist theologian Sally McFaig addressed a full room here at Siegfried Hall and told us that Christians are challenged to go beyond the comfortable borders between humans and nature. She asked us to embrace a new model of Christianity that took our responsibility to the natural world seriously. In her book, Abundant Life, McFaig writes, "This model, which could be," and I'm quoting here, "this model which could be summarized by a version of Irenaeus's watchword, 'The glory of God is every creature fully alive,' provides Christians with new ways to say that God is with us on the earth and that God is for us, especially the oppressed. This new model suggests to Christians that the way to picture God's presence with us is the eschatological banquet to which all are invited, all people and all other creatures." Today, Father Jim Prophet will look at the theological and liturgical assumptions behind that great divide, those borders that McFaig challenges us to go beyond. And we welcome him here today. I'm glad you made Jim feel at home, because I was worried that he would feel alienated when he heard that St. Jerome's University as a public institution is a not-for-profit organization. That's a joke so lame that not even Jesus could make it walk. Jim Prophet notes that outdoor activities, such as sports, gardening, and hiking, are increasing in popularity, and he asks us if these can be experiences of the divine. In other words, is God confined to the indoors? Can acknowledging and nurturing such experiences of the God of the outdoors help bring healing to humanity's destructive relationship with the earth, he asks. And I think this is God's little joke on Jim, that he has to talk about God of the outdoors as a loving God after a week of -20 weather. Jim argues that Christianity has long acknowledged nature as the primary revelation of the God of creation, yet the God of creation is seldom celebrated in our present-day churches. The God that many worship is a God within buildings. Father Jim Prophet is the director and superior of the Ignatius Jesuit Centre of Guelph. He also coordinates the Ecology Project of the Jesuit Centre for Social Faith and Justice. Jim, we like to say, is so green that trees hug him. They don't get any better, folks. Here's another one you may not care for. As director of the Jesuit Centre, Father Jim received national news media attention last year in his valiant effort to block Walmart from building a store across from the Ignatian Retreat Centre, an effort that, alas, has failed. Apparently, there is another God of the indoors being worshipped there. Ordained in 1991, Father Prophet has academic training in agriculture, rural sociology, and theology. Before returning to Guelph 5 years ago, he was pastor at Holy Cross Parish in an Aboriginal community on Manitoulin Island. Previously, he worked with peasant hillside farmers with the St. Mary Rural Development Project in Annotto Bay, Jamaica. So please help me to welcome Jim Prophet.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is great to be here. I've been here many times before. This is such a great series. I've always been on that side of the podium, though, so I am very green at being on this side of the podium. But it is really great to be here to participate in this great series. It's also the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, so it's great to be gathering on that feast day as well. And Thomas, of course, was a good environmentalist as well. And according to Michael Higgins, it's also 3 days' time. It's the birthday of Thomas Merton. And Michael was forbidden to mention Thomas Merton tonight by his staff. So I want to get on his good side, so I'm mentioning it now. So, God of the Outdoors. It's a strange title, perhaps. Yet my experience really is that as Christians of the Western world in particular, we're not particularly comfortable worshipping the God of the outdoors. We're not particularly comfortable praying even to the God of the outdoors. Certainly this has been my own experience as I was growing up, and it continues to be my experience perhaps as an adult as well. Certainly within the Christian church we do have many beautiful buildings which are wonderful artistic expressions of our experience of God. But often our experience of that God gets captured within the church building itself. And so that our sacraments, for instance, sacraments of baptism and marriage, need to be performed within the church building itself. And so that our experience of God tends to be then an experience of a God that we've come to know by being indoor buildings. And of course that's probably understandable, since we in the West are people who primarily have experienced the climate of the North, and it wouldn't be so great to be having this lecture outside tonight. Likewise, it wouldn't be great at some times of the year to have church services outside. But nevertheless, our experience, though, has been an experience of a God that has been indoors. And so I want to examine tonight a bit of what that God of the outdoors might be like, a bit of that broadening our perspective of who God is, examining a bit of the mysticism of God, and examining a bit of the God that leads us to experience the beauty of creation as an expression of the beauty of God. So I'll be speaking tonight of my own experience, and I will be telling you too a bit of my own story. Then I will have a few reflections on the ecological crisis, and then try and offer some reflections on how this experience of God of the outdoors might be able to be used or might be able to give us the energy to be people who are healers of the earth rather than destroyers of the earth. So, my own story. I grew up in a fairly traditional Catholic family. Traditional in many ways. For instance, I come from a family of 9 kids, and our church was very important for us growing up. The only change from regular weekly masses, attendance at regular weekly masses, was a daily mass in the season of Advent and the season of Lent. Our home had the usual Catholic piety that many people who grew up in the 60s and the 70s had. And I am old enough to experience the church before Vatican II, the church during Vatican II, and the church after Vatican II, and some of the confusion and struggle that was there after Vatican II as well. There were many good experiences of the church that I remember. There was no separation, at least in my experience of that church, there was very little separation between the secular and the religious. There was very little separation between Sunday and the rest of the week. We were taught by word and by example to expect God to be a part of all of our day and of all of our week. And our church building itself was a large building. You could fit 1,000 people in it, and on Sundays it was full. And it was full with half of our community who had gathered there. And so it was a wonderful social event of the community as well. And in fact, it was probably the only time that half of the community would gather in our small town that I grew up in. And now when I return to the parish of my youth, I do have the sense that I'm returning to one of my spiritual homes. And so it does evoke for me that good feeling of God. The church remains for me a holy place. And religion was not just an adjunct to my regular life, but it was very much an integral part of it. That was the way that we were brought up. But there were also aspects of that religion which were not so healthy. The image of God, which was cultivated in that church, was a judgmental and a harsh God. God was out there somewhere and demanded reparation. A demanding God who was feared. A God from which I could not escape and knew everything that I was doing. A God who laid down the laws and was there to make sure that I would follow all of the laws and the rules and the regulations. And as Catholics, I also knew that we somehow captured that up there God and put him in the tabernacle, and therefore our church building was a holier place than elsewhere in the world, elsewhere even in the town. And our Catholic obligation was really to submit to the rules of the church in order to get to heaven. And the emphasis was on heaven itself. Earth was only a means to get to heaven. And indeed, in fact, there were aspects of the earth which were evil, or considered to be evil, and that might detract us from our trip to heaven. And so this church then really encouraged the split between the body and the soul, the spiritual and the material, heaven and earth. Now, I admit that I'm exaggerating here in order to make a point. But as a teenager growing up, it didn't always feel like an exaggeration. And there was the oppressive nature of the church, and I experienced that oppressive nature of the church. Yet, I must say, thank God, that the church wasn't the only experience of my youth. I did have a normal upbringing. And in particular, my family fostered an experience of the outdoors. Now, I grew up in a close, extended family. And in that family, there were many farmers. In fact, one part of Prince Edward Island where I grew up, it took me now 5 minutes to mention Prince Edward Island, so take note. I actually grew up in a small town. My father was a potato inspector, but most of my relatives were farmers. But there was one stretch of a highway, which we called Up West, and it was probably about 5 miles long. And when I was preparing this, I counted the number of farms of very close relatives that were within that 5-mile stretch. And there were 7 farms there that I would visit quite regularly because there were relatives that lived there. And in fact, I often said that once we passed the corner of Elmsdale, pretty well everybody was related to me. Even most of the Protestants were also related to me, which was quite remarkable. But in any case, I am digressing there. But farms were very much important part of my upbringing. There was one farm, though, I would say, in that 5-mile stretch that was perhaps more important than the others, and that was the Prophet Homestead. It was the farm that my father grew up on, and it was the farm that I had a cousin live on. My cousin was about my age. He had 6 siblings. He was born 6 months after his father died, and my father and his father were brothers. And so he grew up in a single family or his mother, I should say, was a single mother of 7 children. And so it was a very poor place. It was really my experience of poverty. There was no electricity, there was no running water on this farm, even in the 70s. And so it was my experience of poverty, but perhaps as important, it was also my experience of land, my experience of the land, my experience of land that was also rooted in family. And it was, I must say as well, a very loving environment to be in. But my family, as well as bringing us to all of these farms, my family also camped quite a bit. My father and mother had built a trailer, had built this tent trailer. And it looked like a bit of a mom-pa kettle operation. But they would take it to the campgrounds in our area, and my father then would go to work from this trailer. And I remember my mother saying that she'd love to get us to the beach because we could just run around and she wouldn't have to worry about us and she wouldn't have to worry about waxing floors and all of that sort of thing. And there was a real sense of freedom, I must say, that we did experience. And also a real love for the sea that was developed by camping by the sea itself. When I wasn't on the farms of my relatives, really, I was camping by the sea. Or at least that seemed like the situation. But we also had a big garden behind our house at home. And it was a big garden for a town. It's probably not so big compared to many farmers' gardens. But out of that, my parents grew the vegetables and my mother canned all of the vegetables. And we really had enough vegetables for much of the winter. And so we worked as kids in that garden. And true enough, we did think that we were child laborers and exploited. But I can attest that we were not. And in fact, myself and many of my siblings had an attachment to gardening as well that was developed by working in that garden. Finally, when I was quite young, cross-country skiing was also part of my experience. My father built every one of us a pair of skis. And I can still remember we had an oil cook stove in the kitchen, and I can remember him putting the steamer on top of the oil stove, and it bent the wood, and then out of that bent wood he carved skis for us. And this was really before the days that cross-country skiing was popular. In fact, we didn't take to the skis very well until our neighbours had bought skis, and then it was cool to do that. And so, but nevertheless, we were introduced to the outdoors. We were introduced to the outdoors in minus 20 and minus 30 degree weather, and encouraged to ski. My father had also built a rink in our backyard as well, over the garden. And so there was skating, and the outdoors in the wintertime was very much part of our experience as well. And so I had an experience, really, an upbringing that exposed me to nature, exposed me to the sea and to the land and to the seasons. And I have to admit that I loved being outdoors. There was that joy, there was a sense of freedom, as I said, that we had experienced there, that I had experienced there. And really this had contributed to the attachment to the land and the sea of Prince Edward Island that I still feel today, and that anybody that knows me a little bit can attest to that fact. As I look back now, in some ways, and perhaps in most ways, the world of the outdoors and the world of the indoor church were really two separate realities. The freedom of the outdoor contrasted with the oppressive nature of the rules and the regulations of the church. And if you were to ask me at the time, where do you experience God? Where do I experience God? I would have said, I experience God in the church, because that's what I was trained to come to know God as. It was this God that was in the church. And I probably would not have been able to say that I experienced God outdoors. Yet I knew that there was something about the outdoors that was of God. And I also knew that sometimes I was even brought to spontaneous prayer, even as a kid, when I was outdoors. And so that there was something there, but I would not probably have been able to say that that was where I experienced God. It is not that my church really explicitly excluded the outdoors in its religion, but it did not explicitly include the outdoors in its religion. And so by and large, they remain two separate worlds. Now I must say I'm not the only person of my culture who experienced the split. On a July Sunday of 1896, the 22-year-old Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote, "I suppose I must go and get ready for the evening service." And she was talking about the evening service in a Presbyterian church, for Lucy Maud Montgomery was Presbyterian. "And I must go somewhat against my inclination. Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest, but in reality, it is as hard a work as any in the week. We cook, eat, and wash dishes galore. We dress with weariness to the flesh and tramp to the church in the heat, sit a long and mostly very dull sermon out in stuffy pew, and come home again not a whit better than we went. Not as good, indeed, for we have got a headache and feel very vicious in our pains. I have an ideal Sunday in my mind. Only I am such a coward that I cannot translate it into the real, but must drift on with the current of conventionality. But I would like to go away on Sunday morning to the heart of some great solemn wood and sit down among the ferns with only the companionship of the trees and woodwinds echoing through the dim, moss-hung aisles like strains of some vast cathedral anthem. And I would stay there for hours with nature and my soul." So obviously for her, there was some of that split that was going on as well. Eventually for me, I must say the two worlds did become integrated a bit better. After high school, I chose to study agriculture. It seemed like the logical thing to do. I wanted to work outdoors. I loved being on the farms, and so I chose to study agriculture. I went first to Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and then I transferred up to the University of Guelph. And for reasons which hopefully will become clear by the end of this talk, I now see that the choice to study agriculture was part of my own spiritual journey at the time. Again, at the time, I would have had a clue that that was the case. As I said, I did the last 2 years of my training, or my degree at the University of Guelph, and it was there that I met the Jesuits. That was not really a part of the original plan. But in any case, 2 years after graduation, I came back to Guelph and entered the novitiate there in 1980. And interestingly enough, I made my final decision to proceed to the novitiate on a beach in Prince Edward Island, not in a church. Early, of course, in my novitiate training, I was exposed to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And the exercises began that long journey of integration of my church religion with my love for the outdoors. I began to develop an intimate relationship with Jesus, the God who became a part of the earth. I prayed with the God who was interested in the world, who was interested in me. And I prayed the spiritual exercises on the land around the retreat house itself, and so that the land became an expression, became an instrument, really, of my prayer. I returned to Guelph for my Regency experience after my philosophy studies. And I asked to go to the farm because I had an intuition. Again, this was very much not articulated at the time, but I just had an intuition that I needed to experience the land if I was going to remain a Jesuit. And so I went to the farm community and spent 2 years working on the farm and living in the community that was there. And the farm community celebrated its relationship with the land, that land around the retreat house. The land was sacred, they claimed. And the community there was in the spirit of Jean Vernier's L'Arche, and so they had the understanding that all of us human beings are broken in some way, and that there's nothing to be shameful about in being broken. It was part of our human reality. But they also understood that the land and the air and the trees and the cattle and all of the elements of the earth were about healing. And so that all of that could heal our brokenness. This was the first time, really, that I actually had heard an attempt to articulate a relationship with nature as a relationship with the divine. Relationship with nature as a healing relationship. After Regency, I studied theology in Toronto, and this provided the occasion for me to study the theology of creation. But also the first summer that I was there, I went up north on Manitoulin Island as part of my also theology training. But I went to West Bay, which was a reserve there on Manitoulin Island, and in West Bay there was the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation, and the purpose of the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation was to give Native people an experience of traditional culture, traditional ceremonies, and that sort of thing. So it was to enhance traditional culture, Native art, and whatever. And there were a group of young people there, and so it was a wonderful summer. And I must say, it was there, I digress again, but this building, it was an old building really that was falling down, but they had all of these beautiful native art all over the place. I got in touch with what icons were all about as I sat there and just sat in the midst of all of this artwork. And this art spoke of God, spoke of the Spirit. But early in the summer, I had one experience in particular that was really quite monumental, quite foundational. It was the Native people. There's about 6 or 7 tribes, or reserves, I should say, in the area of Manitoulin Island and on the mainland. And the people of the reserves wanted to have a way to pray for peace within the communities and among the communities themselves. And so they had lit a sacred fire. Now, a sacred fire is basically a fire in the center, but there's a certain ceremonial ways that you light the fire. And it was just lit there for at this time, it had already been lit for about 6 weeks, and they had intended to light it for the summer. And of course, somebody had to be around the fire all the time, tending the fire, but just being there in the spirit of prayer. And so our group went there once. We participated in a pipe ceremony, a sweetgrass ceremony, and some other traditional ceremonies. There were 3 things that happened to me while I was there. First, I must say, I was moved, deeply moved spiritually. A little bit to my surprise, but not really. The second thing that I realized was that nobody had to explain to me what the rituals were about or what the symbols were meant to be. They spoke to me, and I had an intuitive grasp of what these rituals were. I realized later that that was the case because these rituals and symbols spoke to my experience of God in creation. They spoke to my experience of the earth, that joy and that freedom and that peace that I had experienced in the earth itself. And the final thing that struck me as I sat there around the fire was I had this image of the 40-hour devotion. Now, I don't know how many people are old enough to remember the 40-hour devotions in the Catholic Church. And I said, so this is what that 40-hour devotion was about that I used to be dragged to as a kid. Here you had this sacred fire in the middle. Well, we had the altar with the monstrance on the altar itself. And we would all go and be there in a spirit of prayer, a spirit of choir, and just be present to this sacred fire, to this host, really, that symbolized and that was, we believe, the body of Christ. And people were coming and going the whole time, and this experience of the divine was there. But when I made that connection to the 40-hour devotions, which I never understood until that moment, I realized that maybe even my own rituals, my own traditions, could speak also to my experience of God in creation. And perhaps even they were meant to do that, in fact. I returned to theological studies, and after had 3 years really to reflect on this spiritual experience and my whole relationship with the earth itself, and to discover the rich tradition really within our own Christian church, a tradition that I had not really heard of before that. Well, I had some, but certainly not heard of while I was growing up as a child. And I have to admit that I even enjoyed studying theology, which I never thought an Aggie who studied agriculture at the University of Guelph was capable of admitting that he could enjoy studying such an artsy course as theology. I hope there's no Aggies here to embarrass me by hearing this. So, how would one then interpret what was happening to me as I grew up spiritually? I'll attempt an explanation. I had a deep spiritual relationship with the earth since the time that I can remember. My earliest memories really were outdoors. I remember my 4th birthday party. It was on a beach in Prince Edward Island. I would say that as most, if not all children, this relationship was from birth. But unlike some children, this was never quite eliminated and in fact was a source of joy for me throughout my childhood. However, I did not really know that this relationship was a spiritual relationship as such, nor could I describe it as such. I was devoid really of the language to interpret it, to understand it, to explain it, and to celebrate it. I suppose that it's like what it must be really for some young people today to grow up in a family without any faith in that family, and yet are drawn beyond the materialist culture that we have. Yet I did grow up as a devout Christian, and in a devout Christian home. This religious background provided language which included symbol and ritual that spoke mainly of another understanding of God. A God which, frankly, I have come to understand doesn't really exist. So the experience really was not the problem itself. I had the experience of this loving God of the outdoors. But the language which included ritual and symbol to interpret the experience was the problem. I must say that though my experience of the earth was not completely void of an understanding that there was something about this that was of God, though my family was never really explicit in their explanation or their even describing or talking about this relationship that they had in the outdoors, there was some of that nevertheless. My aunt was always quite made certain that there were religious symbols within the barn as well as her house. And so there was something about the barn too that she came to understand as being of God. And so that she was somehow aware that God was outside. I remember my mother's father telling me once, who lived just 3 miles up the road, telling me that he never really worried when he was a farmer. And as a person who runs a farm now in Ignatius, I don't know what that's like, not to worry about it. But he never really worried, and that when something went wrong with the farm or out in the field, he would simply say, "In our Father," and that put it in God's hands, because he said God always provides. And so there was something of the wisdom of the land, I think, which I did incorporate in my being. But my church and their church did not help them really to put words to that experience in the same way that it didn't help me to put words to my experience. But for me, it was Aboriginal spirituality, interestingly enough, that provided the language. The rituals and the symbols spoke to me. The rituals and the symbols expressed my own relationship, my longings, my experience of God, my love for God. I'll end this part of the talk just by telling you a story. When I returned back to Wikwemikong, as David said, just before I came here, but I had about 4 years there. And when I first went to Wikwemikong, I didn't know the community very well, and so I was in the midst of a steep learning curve. And I participated in a sweat. And so the sweat lodge was behind one of the elders' home. And so we went into the home, we changed, and we went into the sweat. And as I was there, it wasn't my first experience of the sweat, but I hadn't had a whole lot before that. When I was there, All of the prayers were in Odawa, which is the language of Wiki, as they call it there. And the ceremonies were very different, really, than many of the Christian ceremonies that I had taken part in. And as I sat there and my mind was wandering, sometimes praying, I wondered whether this man was a Christian. As I said, I didn't really know him very well. And I had concluded when I was there that he wasn't. For one thing, I hadn't seen him in church, but I soon to realize that was no indication at all as to whether or not people were Christian. But it just seemed, the whole ceremony just seemed so different than anything I had experienced within my Christian tradition. And so I had concluded that he wasn't a Christian. Then I got out of the sweat, and we went into the house, the same house that I was in before, and had a feast. And as soon as I get into the house, all of these articles up, or all of these things up on the wall, indicated that he was very much a Christian. There was the Sacred Heart of Jesus and all of these sort of traditional Catholic pictures. Sacred Heart of Jesus, a rosary, and a crucifix were all there. So clearly he was also a Christian. And in fact, most native people in Wiki are Christian, and many of them participate in the Aboriginal way as well. And in fact, there's a lot of integration that's going on there, and that's very exciting to be a part of. But in any case, I came back and I was reflecting this experience to a friend, and I told him the same story. And he said, "Oh, well, it's clear." He says, the Aboriginal way is the religion of the God of the outdoors, and the Christian way is the religion of the God of the indoors. And I think he was right. And I suspect, too, that that's also the way that many Native people experience that as well. So I must point out, before we proceed further, that though my experience of the church did not foster a relationship with the church, that this really has been an aberration within the church history. And as I said before, there's a whole rich tradition, Christian tradition really, of people who did experience the God of the outdoors, the God within creation, and really express this in their writings. And I won't go in that tonight, but Francis of Assisi is the obvious person that most people know, but also Meister Eckhart, Hildegard, Bingen, Julian of Norwich, people of that sort. Even Ignatius, I would claim, is that. But I also will say that my own Celtic ancestors had a very rich tradition too, which saw the goodness of creation. For a period of time, the Celtic Church was able to develop in its own unique way, and far away from the center of the Roman Empire. In fact, Ireland was never really a part of the Roman Empire. Celts managed to integrate their old religion, their old Celtic religion, into the Christian way, into their Christian religion. And this religion believed in the goodness of creation and the sacredness of place, land and sea. And they did not really get embroiled all of that much into Augustine's theology of sin and grace. The early Celtic church embraced monasticism as well. And the church was organized around these monasteries, which were very close to the land itself. And in fact, there were very few large buildings. And probably most of the religious ceremonies were held outdoors, probably in a sacred oak grove or something, because oak was considered to be a sacred tree for the Celtic people. So how did we get then from this Celtic church to the Irish, Scottish, Acadian church that I grew up in Summerside? How did we get from this church of St. Francis of Assisi to the church of my youth? Well, it requires a long answer and probably a subject of many talks that I won't go into here tonight either. But I will point out a few things. Thomas Berry, interestingly enough, says that the experience of the Black Death in Europe was a key moment of transition. Because the Black Death, many people, of course, in Europe died from that. And so all of a sudden nature then became something that wasn't life-giving, but in fact death-causing. And it was hard to experience the goodness of nature when nature was killing you. And so this began then a consciousness that the best thing that we can do, if we want to be holy, is to control nature for the sake of life. And that this, in fact, was a good thing. And it contributed really to the further separation of humanity from nature. Interestingly enough, the Black Death occurred after the time of Francis of Assisi and many of the other creation-centered ancestors of faith that we have. Timothy Joyce lists a number of influences that contributed to the decline of the Irish Celtic Church, including a growing influence of the Church of Rome, which was facilitated in part by the 12th century Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, the Protestant Reformation, the Cromwellian colonization, and the 18th century penal laws as well. The latter, as you know well, contributed to the extent of the potato famine. And this was really the straw that broke the camel's back, that Thomas Joyce would argue. The death of almost 1 million people from famine and the mass immigration of millions contributed to the disappearance of the culture of the Irish peasantry itself and gave rise to an increased influence in the official church. The Catholic Church had a clergy that was increasingly educated in Europe, in the seminaries of Europe. And such a situation as this, really we were dealing with a broken people as well from the famine, in some sense. Such a situation as this was ripe for the introduction really of Jansenism, which emphasized the depravity of nature and understood that goodness really came from grace, from a transcendent God, really. Interestingly enough, there are similarities between Calvinism and Jansenism, and also interesting that the Jesuits were one of the first critiques of Jansenism. And now I understand because it's really quite separate, or quite something different from our spirituality, I would say. I must say that I have been fortunate to witness a spiritual connection to the earth among many people who work with the land. And when I work with farmers, and I have relatives who are also fishers now, because many of my cousins have married fishers, and in fact that's probably the definition of a mixed marriage in PEI, is a fisher marrying a farmer. But I have been fortunate enough to get to know fishers as well, and this deep relationship that they have with the sea. When I went to Wiki, I got to know hunters as well, and came to realize that hunting also was something that brought these people out to the bush, and that there was something spiritual that was going on there as they hunted. I gave a retreat a few years ago out in BC, and after the retreat, one of the horse loggers, which means that he cuts down trees by using a horse in the bush, asked me if I would like to go with him the following day, and of course I just jumped at the opportunity. I would say it was one of the best days I've spent certainly in the last 3 years, as I was there in the Rockies with them and just was with them for the day. You could see this deep relationship, this love he had both with the horse and with the trees itself, as he tenderly sort of worked in the bush that day. I'm not saying that everybody who works in the bush or works with the land are wonderful environmentalists and have this spirituality and treat the earth in a positive way. You would be the first to object to that, and I would be the first to agree with you. But I am saying that if you scratch the surface of any of these people, you'll probably find a relationship that is there. But it's not only these people. I think urban people have that relationship as well. And there is a relationship. If you go to a park on a Sunday morning, I suspect you would find where church is for many people in a city. I'm also saying, though, too, that for many farmers that I know, it is this relationship really that gets them through this situation of stress that they have. And that it is that relationship really that keeps them going. I want to switch gears, though, for a moment and highlight the ecological crisis in which we live. And then reflect on how this spirituality of the earth might help to relieve the crisis and enable us to bring about earth healing itself. Our lifestyle today is completely unsustainable. And I'm not so sure that we really can comprehend the extent of that sentence. It's a simple fact that we are living beyond the carrying capacity of the earth itself, and that we cannot continue to live the way that we are living. Our materialistic lifestyle is possible only by the inexpensive use of fossil fuels. We are now at what many people call the peak oil stage, and that means that we have come to know really all of the reserves of fossil fuels that are in our earth today, and that there will be no more major discoveries of fossil fuels. And so it also means then that there will be a diminishing resource from now on. And in fact, many people would say that we have 50 years left, and before the 50 years comes, fossil fuel itself will become very expensive. And so rather than go into the detail of all of the ecological crisis, I just want to focus a bit on our food system and how this is an aspect of our ecological crisis itself. The agricultural system which produces our food is completely out of balance. Over the last 60 years, industrial agriculture has been introduced. The farm that I was exposed to of my relatives in the 1960s and 1970s is not this industrial agriculture. But those farms aren't around anymore. In fact, those 7 farms that are there, only 2 of them are farming now. One of them is farming part-time, and I have a cousin that is a dairy farmer, and so he has incorporated all of this industrial model into his own farm itself. Efficiency and financial survival have become equated to increased volume per unit in a similar way that a car factory attempts to produce more cars per labor, per factory, and in the same way that Walmart, there's the word, survives by selling a greater volume of products per square foot. And like cheap products at Walmart, consumers have cheap food. 10% of our incomes are used for food, and this has never been lower in our history, and in fact, next to the United States, it is the lowest in the world itself. And I do use the word consumers deliberately. Food is now a commodity that is not eaten by people, but rather that is bought by consumers. And so even the language itself has taken any sense of relationship out of it. But this industrial cheap food system really is not cheap. And the real cost of production have been internalized and borne by farmers and by the earth itself. In Canada, for the last 2 years, the net income for farmers has been less than zero. Now that's the average farm. So they're losing money. 3/4 of the farm income presently comes from off-farm income. And so that basically farmers support their habit of farming by working off the farm itself. Farmers only get a very small percentage of our food dollar, and I suspect we know this. The food industry, as it is called, interesting language, is controlled increasingly by fewer and fewer vertically integrated agri-food companies and distribution companies as well, resulting in the consolidation and control of food production into a few, and it really is only a few now, non-farm companies. And so no matter what the ads of these companies might say with their pastoral images of a lovely farm, the decisions about our food policy are made in corporate boardrooms, not at the farmer's land and gate. And the earth continues to bear the brunt of these costs. Agriculture consumes, interestingly enough, 20% of the fossil fuels of North America. And this is fueling, this fossil fuels are fueling not only the large machinery that is needed to farm now, but especially the fertilizers, actually. Nitrogen fertilizer is a big consumer of fossil fuels, and our pesticides as well. The food that we eat, interestingly enough, travels 2,500 kilometers by the time it reaches our table. And when we sit down for food, we are celebrating the United Nations because our food on average comes from 5 nations when we sit down to eat food. And interestingly enough, we are living in the breadbasket of Canada here in southern Ontario. To produce 1 calorie of food, it takes 2.5 calories to produce it. 2.5 calories of fossil fuel. And when we include food processing, packaging, and transportation, 1 calorie of food requires more than 6 calories of fossil fuel. And so this production of food is one of the major contributor then to greenhouse gas production, contributing to climate change itself. So bigger industrial farms have also caused a loss in biodiversity and genetic diversity as well, as biological habitats for non-food species have been transformed by monocropped fields and fewer varieties and species of plants and animals that are used on the farm. Modern agriculture also has killed our soils, making them much more vulnerable for wind and water erosion. And modern agriculture also contributes to the pollution of our waterways, depletes our water supplies, and increases the stress for farm families and deteriorates the quality of life in our farm communities and our rural communities in general. Andrew Kimbrell states, over the last century, we have been transformed from a nation of farmers with our hands and our minds linked to the soil to consumers lined up in the supermarkets to buy an array of slickly packaged food products about which we know very little. The great physical and psychological distance between consumer and food production creates a tragic disconnect between the general public and the social and environmental consequences of the food being grown and eaten. And so what he's saying, that there is this distance then between us and the food. It's a social and psychic distance, he says. But I also say that it is a spiritual distance that has developed there. And so that the system of our food production is not only financially and socially and ecologically bankrupt, it is also spiritually bankrupt. And so let's talk a bit more about this then. For many of the political and business leaders today, the problems created by the industrialization of food can be solved by more of the same dedication to our sciences, technology, and commercial projects. More control of nature and of humans who are a part of nature will ensure that our lifestyle will be maintained. And so the solutions of the problem of agriculture then lie in new technologies, such as biotechnology or nanotechnology, or more and bigger industrial farms, such as factory farms. President Bush, too, when he instructed Americans to consume more after the crisis of September the 11th, more of the same, in order to keep the economy going. And the so-called security threat can be addressed by more arms development. And the war in Iraq, really, as we all know, was never anything about security, and less even about chemical weapons. It is ultimately a war about controlling a diminishing resource of fossil fuels. And the problem of the diminishing resources of the earth can be solved simply by exploiting new resources. President Bush announced his space program to Mars, and in that he said there is a great potential there to use the resources of Mars for our own benefit. Interesting. The ecological crisis is rooted in our deep convictions and our own worldview. Consumerism and materialism, the myth of progress and economic growth, and our determined effort to control nature are destroying the environment. Yet underlying these attitudes is a deeper problem still, and that problem is a spiritual problem. In Zimbabwe, Peter Hans Kovenbach, who was the general of the Jesuits, he stated this: "At the origin of the ecological crisis is denial, indeed even more than in word. Denial of our relationship with God. To cut with God is to cut with the source of life. It is to cut with the fundamental love and respect for life. And when we are so cut off, then we permit ourselves to destroy life, and ecologically speaking, the conditions of life." The origins of our ecological crisis, he's saying, is a crisis of spirit. It's our denial of our relationship with God in deed and in act. If our crisis is to change, then transformation must take place at the root of the problem. And so this environmental problem is demanding that we cease to look upon the earth simply as material, and is begging a new relationship with the earth itself, between humanity and the remainder of the earth. David Suzuki, interestingly enough, I didn't realize that David was here. David, as if I know him personally. Mr. Suzuki, Dr. Suzuki was here. But I did see him in Tuesday night in Toronto. There was a gathering of religious types with David Suzuki. And there he said, and interestingly enough, David formerly, and he admitted this, was formerly suspicious of religion. He told the group that gathered there that the most important need in Canada is the need for spirit. The most important need in Canada is the need for spirit. An interesting comment. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that one solution to the ecological crisis, and perhaps the most important solution even, is to foster this spiritual relationship with the earth, is to get to know the God of the outdoors. The more we can live out of a spirituality of the earth, the more we're liable to become healers of the earth, rather than destroyers of the earth. The more we fall in love with the earth, the more we will be motivated to act for the earth. Act not out of a sense of guilt or shame, but act out of a sense of love. The root of the earth crisis is a spiritual crisis. The solution to this crisis, then, begins with spiritual conversion. And so I'll finish my talk this evening just by pointing out some of the key aspects that I would consider of this spirituality that will help us in this time of ecological crisis, that will foster healing with the earth itself, and will be important in enabling us as individuals and as a society to live in balance with the rest of the earth. First thing is that a spirituality earth takes for granted that God is present in the universe. Now, there's been books written on just how we want to explain that. And really what we're getting in touch with really is the undescribable or the unexplainable. We're getting in touch with the reality of mystery. Ignatius of Loyola says that God dwells in creatures. Meister Eckhart stated that God is everywhere and everywhere complete. God is in the innermost part of each and everything. All species reflect the divine. Thomas Aquinas, whose feast we're celebrating today, stated that God is so huge that God cannot be reflected in any one species. In fact, God needs all species in order to reflect the beauty of God. The assumption that God is present in the universe has various implications. First of all, I think for most of us it means that we need a broadened expansion of God. We cannot keep God in the box. The God has to pop out of that box, and we have to enjoy the new experience of God and allow our understanding of who God is to expand. God is mystery. The earth is God's body, according to Sally McVeigh. For Ignatius, God is a laborer in creation, laboring for us within all of creation. The second thing is that the earth itself is sacred. The earth is sacred. Interestingly enough, our discussion about Walmart in Guelph was a discussion about sacred land and whether or not the official plan can protect sacred land. We found that it couldn't. And yet our experience is that the land is sacred, the earth itself is sacred. The Celtic spiritual tradition really had an understanding that there were these thin spaces where it becomes very palatable, this connection with the divine and with the land itself. Aboriginal traditions understand that a valley or a hilltop or whatever has a soul. Interesting. And I think you can experience this. When you go into a valley, you pick up something about that. I would call that a soul. Or a beautiful tree. I can think of a tree on our property, 300-year-old tree. When I go in there, I am struck by a sacred reality. Am I touching with the soul of the tree? Perhaps I am. Thirdly, to destroy the earth in this way, then it is also injuring God. When we pollute a river, we are witnessing to the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross. Human relationship with the earth is a relationship with the divine. And Calvin DeWitt says that to lose a species of life is like ripping a page from sacred scripture and losing it for all time. I think it's a good image. We are impoverished, and God is impoverished when we lose a sacred species. When we experience the earth as sacred, when we experience an island, a valley as sacred, when we experience trees as sacred, when we experience a graveyard as sacred, when we experience food as sacred, then I suspect we are less likely to abuse creation. And so this wall between the sacred and the secular must vanish. Bay Street must become a holy place. The second thing is that our post-industrial age would benefit from the awareness that humans are a part of creation and not separate from it. And David mentioned this in his introduction. And our religious traditions really reflect this spiritual understanding when they say that human beings are created in Genesis 2 out of the topsoil of the earth. And science, of course, tells us that we are stardust and that there's not a whole lot of difference in the amount of genes between myself and a rat. And so we are much more connected than we thought we were. We are a part of the earth. Lucy Maud Montgomery, who became this Presbyterian minister's wife, this is probably the only lecture you're going to hear where Lucy Maud Montgomery is quoted twice in an evening. But she knew of this connection and experienced it as being spiritual. She said in the 1920s, Lucy Maud Montgomery eventually moved away, like I have moved away, but went back, and the island would feed her. And this is how she describes it in 1920 when she returned to PEI. She says that she found her soul. Interestingly enough, in this quote too that I will quote, she uses the word Abigwit, which is the Mi'kmaq name for Prince Edward Island. A little bit prettier, I would say, than naming ourselves after a prince. But anyway, peace, she says, peace. You never know what peace is until you walk on the shores or in the fields or along the winding red roads of Abigwit on a summer twilight, when the dew is falling and the old, old stars are peeping out and the sea keeps its mighty tryst with the little land it loves. You find your soul then. You realize that youth is not a vanished thing, but something that dwells forever in the heart. And you look around on the dimming landscape of haunted hill and long white sandy beach and murmuring ocean, on homestead lights of old fields tilled by dead and gone generations who have loved them. And you will say, why, I have returned home. Land, soul, peace, home. A spiritual reality. From this Presbyterian minister's wife in the 1920s. For Maud, there was an interesting connection between her body and the land of her birth. And it has to do with home, and it has everything to do with soul. And when we understand that human beings are a part of the earth, then our concern for the poor becomes an ecological issue, not ecology as one more issue of human social justice. Because humans are a part of the earth. And we cannot be an environmentalist if we are not also concerned about the poor. And we cannot be concerned about the poor if we're not also concerned about the earth. The belief that we are humans that are separate from the earth is so ingrained with us. Even myself, I must say, I still think that, even though I know differently and I experience differently. But it's so ingrained in us that I think for most of us it requires a conversion experience. Václav Havel says that by perceiving ourselves as part of the river, we take responsibility for the river as a whole. A third aspect of this spirituality, which I think would be a benefit for us in this day and age, is that all species have their particular place to play within creation, and their particular role to play as well. Fish can use oxygen from water in a way that I simply cannot do. And that all life forms then have their role to play within creation. We humans, like any species, have a special role within creation as well. Our brain size and intelligence make us unique. The authors of Genesis tried to articulate this spiritual experience as well by saying that God breathes within us, or that we were made in the image and likeness of God. But unfortunately, we've taken this and we have interpreted it as our rationale, really, for abusing the earth itself and saying that we are somewhat special and that we have special status. And we have forgotten about what humility is all about. But a spirituality of the earth calls for humility. Humans are part of the earth. And so humility, also, and humans are all the same root word, which means ground or earth. And so if I fall through the ice, for instance, as I have a couple of times, I found out that I can't survive in this ice like a polar bear or a beaver might be able to. Or that I can't use the oxygen of the water in the way that a fish can. An elder once told me that humans are the weakest of all animals because they are the most dependent on all other life forms for our existence. And so what we seek here then is respect for all creatures, including animals and plants that produce our food, including the worms of our soil, including the black flies, and including even creatures such as George Bush. No hierarchy implied there. There is also an interconnectedness, of course, between all within creation, and I think the more and more we get in touch with this reality, too, would be of our benefit. We feel this when we have a spiritual experience of creation. We feel an interconnectedness, and often when I have people describe the spiritual experience, that's one of the first things they put up there is I feel connected to all that is. And we can observe this when we see that the junk we put in the river not only pollutes the river and may kill the fish of the river, but the PCBs in that junk is also in the breast milk of Inuit women up north. And the tsunami disaster tells us this as well, that we are all connected, and how the response of humanity is just another way in which we are connected. Our experience of gardening tells us this. And this connectedness is also a part of the unified whole, and this whole is divine. When I study the community of life beneath my feet when I'm standing on soil, I am drawn to an experience of the divine, the interconnectedness of all that is. When we act, we must do so knowing that our actions have consequences for all of creation. And our spirituality of the earth also helps us get in touch with the reality of death. And in our culture, I think we have an avoidance of death. We run from death. And yet, we cannot get in touch with creation without getting in touch with the reality of death itself. In order to eat, we have to kill animals and kill plants, or most of us do. And yet that is a death that leads to life, death that is for the sake of life. And so it is really part of the Paschal mystery that we are participating in itself, a death that leads to life. And this is within the earth. This is also within the Eucharist that I celebrate when I celebrate the resurrection of Jesus as well. The reality of death that leads to life. The spirituality of the earth also should not be separated from an experience of religion. As I've heard Heather Eaton, who is a professor at St. Paul's, professor of theology at St. Paul's in Ottawa, say that spirituality is the air, religion is the lungs. Spirituality is the flesh, religion is the skeleton. Spirituality needs religion, and religion needs spirituality. Spirituality alone is like air that will float from place to place and not be rooted in culture or tradition or in a community. And it risks really becoming very individualistic. Religion without spirituality risks becoming empty and dead. Last Sunday, I gave a lecture with Ted Settle, who was an organic farmer, or we had a session there on spirituality and farming at the Organic Agriculture Conference, I should say. And it's interesting that the Organic Agriculture Conference has a session on spirituality and farming. And so I got people to reflect on their spiritual experience. It was mostly a young crowd that was there. And so all of these wonderful images came up, connectedness, peace, love, all of that sort of thing. And it was wonderful, actually, to hear this. Then I said, well, what does this have to do with religion? And one woman raised her hand, and I think she probably spoke for most in the room and said, nothing. She said, spirituality is good, and religion is ritual, dogma, politics, and money. That was her experience of religion. I must say I expected something of that sort. I didn't expect it so dramatic, I suppose. But nevertheless, I must say, in all fairness to this woman, we did have a wonderful discussion on this, and she realized that many of her spiritual experiences were really religious experience for her. A religion without spirituality risks becoming a social political body, and dare I say, risks becoming simply empty ritual, rules and regulations, dogma, politics, and money. Perhaps for us the challenge is to allow our religion, our rituals, and our symbols to be transformed by spirituality of the earth and to be enlivened by life itself. And finally, spirituality itself cannot be divorced from action. When we have a spiritual experience, it is an experience of love, and according to Ignatius, that all love needs to show itself in action. And so all spirituality, all religion needs to lead to action, and it's action for the earth itself. And the final point I will make is that a spirituality of earth, and I think that this is the best thing about the spirituality really, it leads us to be people of hope. When we experience the earth, we experience life. We experience that the earth is ultimately about life. When we experience the evolutionary story, we experience that out of all crises has come life. When we experience the life at spring, we experience the resurrection within the earth itself. And this experience leads to hope. I remember giving a retreat for farmers in Manitoba, and there was a farm couple there who were about to lose their farm from financial problems, and in fact came with great stress. And at one point I said to her, do you have any hope? And she says, well, if we're farmers, she says, you always have hope. You plant the seed in spring and you just wait, and you wait in hope. Farming is about hope. Here in Waterloo, Nettie Weave gave a talk about 3 years ago. And Nettie Weave is a United Church member out west, one of the best and most articulate spokespeople on the agricultural crisis in our food system. And so she was talking about this, and someone said, where do you find hope? And she just sat back and said, I have hope because I am a farmer. I have hope because I touch daily into the resilience of life within the earth itself. I have hope because I am a farmer. The spirituality of the earth is an experience of hope. And that hope inspires our action. And so we act not out of fear, not out of guilt, not out of shame, but out of love and in the spirit of hope. And so we live in a time of ecological crisis. And this ecological decline is caused by human activity, unlike any ecological decline in our evolutionary history. We risk not only the elimination of other species, but the elimination of our species itself. And indeed, the destruction of the earth is not outside the realm of possibilities. And so we have a great challenge ahead. But we also live in a time of great hope and a time of great potential. Thomas Berry says that we live in a cosmological and religious moment of grace, and that such moments have occurred throughout the evolutionary history, causing great transformations to occur. And the future of the earth, he says, are defined by these moments. And so that this is one of those moments, and it is a moment of great possibilities. And this is the moment when we celebrate the sacred unity of all that is, and the sacred unity of the diversity of an ecosystem, of humanity with the universe, of the God of the indoors with the God of the outdoors. We rejoice in our experience of mystery within the earth, and we receive hope from the mystery of life itself. We hear the call from the universe for us to participate in the great work, as Thomas Berry would say, the great work of this moment, the work for ecological healing. It is the moment to translate our relationship with the earth into relationships of kindness, compassion, and a deep reverence for the mystery of all life and for all elements of the universe, all the elements in life which bears and reveals the mystery to us. Our response itself is a part of the great ability of the earth to heal herself, to be about life. And so that when we participate in the healing of the earth, we become the ability of the earth to heal herself. This moment of grace is requiring action for the earth, and this healing of the earth will happen by one person, one community acting at a time. And as Margaret Mead reminds us, we should not doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only way that the world has ever changed. So thank you very much.
Father Jim has agreed to take some questions.
Hi, my name is Brendan. I'm a student here at St. Jerome's. Father Jim, I was wondering, I picked up an issue of Catholic Digest this morning, and I looked on the first page, and there was an advertisement for an investment company. And it said, Christian morality won the election, now we can use it to make our investments, something like this. And I thought to myself, like, how on earth can so many of us Christians associate our moral beliefs and our moral values with maybe right-wing political parties that back consumerism, capitalism, free market economies, that back them so wholeheartedly? How can we morally support them, and why do we do that?
I think it's always important to remember that there is pluralism within the Christian church. I cannot explain how anybody could support much of the right-wing movement within the Christian church. It's contrary to my experience of God. It's contrary to how I would translate that experience of God into love. And so I don't pretend to even try and justify it. I cannot understand, quite frankly, how President Bush, who does claim to be a Christian, and I don't deny that at all, and I don't doubt that. But I cannot understand how he can bring a number of people to war. I cannot understand how he has tried to undo all of the environmental laws in the United States and all of that sort of thing. I can't understand how a person who can be pro-life can do such a thing. It doesn't fit my experience. But I don't know. I suppose it would be best to ask them. But I suspect if we were to ask them, they don't have that experience of the earth that I would have and that others would have, and so that they don't have that experience of God. And at the same time, I will admit that my experience of God is quite short too, and how I translate that into my actions is quite contradictory as well. So we are all sinners as well. Ignatius says that we are sinners who are loved by God. And, well, that's who we are as well. We are all sinners and saints at the same time. And our church is full of both.
Hi, my name's Karen O'Neill, and I'm a student here at UW as well. And Dr. David Suzuki was here yesterday, as you know, and he mentioned that the 110 Challenge, the way that they are going about it, it's the whole idea of the 110 Challenge is something that he endorses, but perhaps maybe the way to motivate people is to connect them with the Spirit. But when the beer store used to sell shirts that said, save this animal, or sometimes on television now, on a kids station, they have, this is a prairie dog, this is what they do, this is how you can kind of, save the fuzzy prairie dog. But how do you motivate an audience and a population to connect with the Spirit of the earth, and to see this as not just something that can save you money, something that can save the ozone, but see it as something deeply spiritual, if we all live in this consumer-driven, money, capitalistic society?
Yeah, good question. I think we take small steps, For me, the beginning step would be to encourage people to come to our land and experience the land and the beauty of the land. They don't have to experience it necessarily as an experience of the divine, but they do fall in love. And out of their love with this piece of the earth, they will want to hopefully change their life accordingly. Now, at the same time, we all live within a society that doesn't encourage us to live in harmony with the earth. So I did have to drive over here tonight. I didn't take public transportation, for instance, And so our society doesn't help us. But at the same time, we take small steps at the time. I'm glad that you mentioned David Suzuki's Nature Challenge, because I have one of these, and there's probably one for everybody, which is what Faith in the Common Good has taken. It's called Renewing the Sacred Balance. And they have taken David Suzuki's Nature Challenge and put it within explicitly a religious context, an inter-religious context. And what's nice about the Nature Challenge is that they're very small things. To cut back on my meat consumption, cut back on my use of fossil fuels. They're not big things. They're very small things. And I think that's the way that we begin, But at the same time, maybe, also use our eyes and our ears to experience creation, so that when we walk outside in the summertime and see a dandelion growing in the crack of a sidewalk, we're inspired by the message of life that it has, rather than allowing us to go for a kill-X to kill it, But rather have it talk to us about God and about the divine, or at least about life itself, and the beauty and the resilience of that dandelion to grow in the crack of a sidewalk, So I don't know if that answers, but...
You mentioned hunters as among the people who sort of partake of the spirituality of the earth that you're talking about. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little. I mean, is there a paradox there in sort of killing animals being a way of being connected to the earth?
Yeah. We also are beef farmers at Guelph, or at least for the moment we are, so... I don't think there is. I think the reality of death is within creation itself. And it's always, though, the difference is that it's always death for the sake of life. And so killing animals for the sake of our food system, for the sake of our food, for the sake of our life, is not a contradiction. Death is the reality within creation. And I find, in fact, some people who go to the bush, they come back with this romantic view of creation and forget that animals are killing other animals, or animals are eating other trees, and so that death is very much a part of that. The difference, though, and so within hunting, for instance, the difference between what I would say hunting as good and hunting as not so good is the respect that it's done. And how does it bring me in contact with the earth itself? Is there a spiritual experience that's happening when I hunt? I've never hunted, I must say. But what I noticed among native people, that was happening. And that people went to the bush, in fact, to hunt. To really, in the same reason why I would go to a church on Sunday. It was something, hunting was only a small part of everything else that was going on. And of course, always when native people would kill an animal, they would offer tobacco and thank the spirit of the animal for giving up its spirit for the sake of my life. And so it's done with respect. And so it's a relationship of love. It's a relationship of connectedness with the earth itself. I've seen that with this horse logger who killed trees. In BC. I've seen it among many fishers, and I've seen it among many farmers as well. So the difference then, so for me, beef farming is not at all the problem. In fact, animals are a part of the earth, and so we need the manure and the fertility that animals have that give us. But the way we farm cattle, the way we presently farm hens that produce the eggs, is extremely problematic, because the connectedness is not there, the spirituality is not there, and quite frankly, the abuse of animals is there. In an organic farm, in all organic farms that I know of, that relationship of respect is there, which is why at an organic agricultural conference you would have a session on spirituality of farming, because it's a given, I think, for many of these people who farm.
My name is Sandra. I'm just a member of the community, but it's something that I've thought about and struggled with. Do we try to integrate this concept of the God of the outdoors with the God of the indoors, or is that, or we just kind of get rid of the God of the indoors idea, that concept of traditional Christianity and those concepts that we grew up with? Do we just make them fade away somehow?
Yeah.
We need to be converted.
I think we get rid of the judgmental God. The God who is the God that we've learned to fear in many ways. We get rid of that God because that God doesn't exist for me. But it doesn't mean that we get rid of the God of the indoors. I've had many religious experiences within buildings, within churches, within my home growing up. And so we don't get rid of that God, but rather the whole God is all God. I mean, it's the unity that we celebrate. And really, when we have an experience of God, of a loving God, that experience of love, we need to express it ritually. We need to express it in a communal way. And often that happens within doors. But it's our experience of the outdoor God, or the God within creation. But we do that within a church building. And when you see, in my view, when you see cathedrals that are very artistically done, they're expressing this God of the outdoors, if you like, or this experience of God. And they're doing it in a materialistic way. And so that it is an experience of beauty when you go inside a church. And it is an experience of beauty because it does express the true God, as I have come to know God in the limited way that I have. And so that that it is the same God, whether it's in the building or out of the building. So we need both, in other words. My point basically is that the church that I grew up in primarily emphasized that church only in the indoors, and that you had to come indoors in order to experience that God.
Hi, my name is Derek. My question is, do you see a connection between the biodiversity of the earth and the multitude of different faiths among our earth?
Yeah, I've often said that any good ecosystem is a unity of great diversity. Any good society is a unity of diversity. Any good church is a unity of diversity. And so it celebrates the diversity. So rather than diversity becoming a potential source of division, it's something to be celebrated. And it's something to yearn for the unity when there is division there. But ultimately, we should celebrate diversity of cultures, diversity of language. And interestingly enough, I mean, we're not only losing species, but we're losing cultures and we're losing languages. So it's a loss of culture that our Western society is also causing as well. David Suzuki the other night when he began, and I must say we were in a mosque and there was about 1,000 people there. And it was Toronto at its best, you know. It was recent immigrants, and there were some of us old folks there too that have been here for generations. But we were all there. And David Suzuki came out and said, "I'm just struck by what a wonderful experiment that Canada is," as he looked out. And it is an experiment, really, of this unity of diversity. And so the more we can celebrate that, the more we can be that, I think the closer to God that we are. Our notion of God, interestingly enough, within Christianity, is a unity of the Trinity, and so it is a unity of diversity as well.